In 1928, northern Brazil was captivated by an enticing bit of news. The region's residents were about to receive a new visitor. A man who came with the promise of reviving their ailing economy and introducing them to a whole new way of life? Henry Ford. Local papers began raving about their future neighbor. Speculation ran wild. Some columnists opined that Ford would be building a new railroad to the coast. Or a new factory for his cars. Above all, they just wanted to know when he would be arriving. Officially, Ford's interest in Brazil was a business venture. The monopoly on Sri Lankan rubber maintained by Britain was driving up costs for his new model, cars. So he wanted to find a cheap source of latex that would allow the Ford Motor Company to produce its own tires, to cut costs. But Ford Officially, Ford's interest in Brazil was a business venture. The monopoly on Sri Lankan rubber maintained by Britain was driving up costs for his new model, cars. Ford Motor Company to produce its own tires, to cut costs. But Ford's vision ran much deeper. His goal was not simply to ship latex back to the company's Dearborn headquarters. It was to build his vision of the ideal city. A city that would fuse the same concepts that Ford had championed throughout his career, and bring a better future to a forgotten part of the planet, and that city would bear his name. Fordlandia. It is difficult to overstate the reputation Henry Ford had built for himself by that time, whether in Brazil, America, or anywhere else on the planet. In his day, Ford's name was every bit as evocative of the glimmering promise of technological revolution as Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg. Perhaps even more so. Within a decade of its founding in Dearborn, Michigan in 1903, the Ford Motor Company had revolutionized car production by introducing the assembly line, isolating tasks within the complex process of car assembly, allowing new models of his flagship vehicle, the Model T, to be cranked out faster than ever before, making the company a global success. Yet Ford's greatest innovation was arguably not mechanical, but social. He took pride in the fair treatment of his staff, and in 1914, to great fanfare, he paid $5, the equivalent of $120.90. Today, Ford believed fair treatment would make his workers more responsible citizens and, in the process, solidify a client base from manufacturers. The Reverend Samuel Marquis, one of the heads of Ford's Employee Relations Office, once proclaimed that Ford's cars were the byproducts of his real business, which is the making of men. But some of Ford's social ideas were highly sinister, most notoriously his anti-Semitism, which featured prominently in a newspaper he himself printed, the Dearborn Independent. He became increasingly convinced that his role in advancing society had to go beyond the factory floor and encompass entire cities. While he succeeded in bringing some of his smaller urban planning concepts to life, his much larger project, a massive manufacturing city to be built in northern Alabama, 75 miles long, with power supplied by damming the Tennessee River, never got off the ground. Eventually, Ford settled on a location for his ideal city that was a good deal further south than Alabama. A work of civilization? By the 1920s, the Amazon basin lay in shambles, at the end of the previous century. The region had benefited from a monopoly on global rubber production, skyrocketing demands, and easy transportation via the navigable waters of the Amazon River. Cities along the river had swelled with new residents seeking their fortunes, and had lined their streets with opulent new buildings. Belém, at the mouth of the river, became the busiest port in Brazil. Upriver, Manaus became world-famous for its decadent Amazon theater, but the cultivation of rubber trees could not be standardized. Placing them too close together exposed them to blight and parasites, and though these trees only grew natively in Brazil, it wasn't long before enterprising botanists decided they would try planting them in other, tropical regions, where they had no natural parasites. The British began growing rubber in Sri Lanka. After a rubber tree's seeds were famously smuggled out of Brazil, and by the beginning of the century, this produce was vastly outperforming Brazil's rubber crop. The Amazon basin, heavily dependent on proceeds from rubber sales, was devastated. We are not going to South America to make money, but to help develop that wonderful and fertile land. Henry Ford, fresh off the failure of his Alabama development, Ford grew fascinated with the economically ravaged Amazon as a potential site for a reboot. of his utopian aspirations.